not when you're already on the signal.
EIT?
EIT. Yeah, we could just grip out like that. So, I know you should be above that. Do you? How high? Where do you live now? Have you been back there? Oh, did you? Okay, so yeah. So you know Dave. Oh, Chris. Well, it's glad as actually just doing it through all these guys.
Good afternoon. My name is David Heyman, former Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and member of the Aspen Institute's Homeland Security Group. I'm delighted to introduce our next session entitled Cyber Policy and National and International Levels. We've already talked a little bit about some of the threats and concerns today in cyberspace. Hackers, criminals, and state actors who steal people's identities, corporate secrets, and of more concern, have sought to sabotage the vital physical infrastructure that sustains our daily lives. This panel will look to what we can and are doing at home and internationally to counter those threats. Specifically, the panel will explore many questions that the rise of these threats and the parallel rise of the new world of ubiquitous connectedness and the Internet of Everything raise for policymakers. How do we protect our increasingly connected society, and who's responsible for what? What are the rules of the road at home and across the globe? And what are the ways, or how do we get to a place where normative behavior is agreed upon internationally and enforced internationally? Moderating this session, we have John Markoff. John is probably the longest and perhaps oldest reporter covering this. He goes back to the 1970s, writing the same stories till most recently. And he's a reporter now at the science section in the New York Times. He was part of a group of reporters who won the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting in 2013, and has a forthcoming book to be published this fall called Machines of Loving Grace, The Quest for Common Ground Between Humans and Machines. And with that, the floor is yours, John. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. My panelists to my immediate left are Keith Alexander, who is now CEO and co-founder of IronNet Cybersecurity, and he was the director of the National Security Agency and commander of U.S. Cyber Command. Suzanne Spaulding is to his left. She is now Undersecretary of Homeland Security for National Protection and Programs Directorate. And to her left is Chris Young, who is General Manager, Intel Security. And we're charged with conversing about the rules of the road in cyberspace and how to find common ground. And I just thought it was so striking yesterday that Director Comey spent about half of his interview talking about cyber, which shows where we are today. And I just wanted to frame it briefly before we start, because I really feel like Rip Van Winkle. I think I wrote the first story on cyber warfare. It appeared in November of 1981. And I quoted, and it was about discovering a backdoor that existed between a mathematics research center in Austria and the Kremlin, allowing them to have access to the ARPANET. And somebody at ARPA said to me, maybe we could settle the whole thing by with a giant computer space war game, which might still be a good idea. And I wanted to sort of place that against where we are. The Watson come here quick moment of the internet happened on October 29th, 1969 at 10 p.m. at night. And it was a message sent between node 1, which was in Menlo Park, and node 0, which was in Los Angeles at UCLA. And it involved, it was the cloud. It was not an electronic mail message. It was remote login to a machine. And a young hacker by the name of Bill Duvall sent a message, and he typed L, and then he typed O, and then he typed G. And on G, the system crashed. And it crashed because of a buffer overflow problem. A very straight forward programming error, programming design error. And I checked today. And here we are 45 years later. And there were announcements both by the Chrome team at Google and the Mozilla Firefox team that they had patched buffer overflow errors. And that's really quite remarkable that the system that we've built is still that kind of a fragile system. And just a final note before we start on metaphors, because we're charged with this notion of discussing the rules of the road. And this notion of a data highway, I think, is perhaps one of the worst metaphors we could possibly pick for the world that we're living in. Maybe if this was a quantum universe, where every address was next to every other address, that would make sense, because that's the kind of road it is. There are no good and bad neighborhoods. I think a better metaphor might be a global commons. It might be the cyber Tahrir Square, is where we are today. Everybody is right next to everybody, and that is the problem, and of course, the benefit. So, I come at this as a real pessimist. I walked away from my beat in 2011. I decided that after Luz Sack and Anonymous, that if I had to write about one more testosterone-poisoned teenager with an attitude, I was going to have an aneurysm, and it was time to do something else. So what I'd like our panelists to start out with, perhaps I could ask Keith first, is sort of let's calibrate this. Give me something to be optimistic about. Give me a sense that we're making progress.
Well, I'd start with technology. And you look at the tables that are out here right at the front. Look at how far we've gone in technology. It's doubling every 2 years. The amount of unique information that we're creating this year will be more than the last 5,000 years combined. In 2000, it cost us $3 billion and took a mammoth effort to map the human genome. And now you're going to do that with devices that are about $5,000 or less. What they've used Watson for at IBM was taking it from a machine that played Jeopardy to a machine that's now helping to cut down the time for cancer research for people with brain cancer and other things. There's some tremendous opportunities there. And we get this question, should we slow down? And absolutely not. What's going on in this area here is going to change the way we live for good. And what we have to do, as you mentioned, 1969, this is the country that created the internet. We ought to be the first to secure it, and we can do that. I'm very optimistic that we can do that.
Good. We'll talk more about that.
Suzanne. It shouldn't take more than a day. If Chris does it.
Suzanne.
Well, John,
where are the points of optimism?
Yes, let me start by thanking the Aspen Institute for having me back again this year. It's great to be back here, and I want to thank all of you who are in here instead of out there on this gorgeous day. As we walked up to get mic'd and the room was pretty empty, I thought, well, that's understandable. It's a beautiful day out there, but you all came back. And so where Keith sees signs of optimism in technology, I have to say I see signs of optimism in people. We have people's attention. There's the expression, never let a good crisis be wasted. And we definitely have folks' attention, and I see folks are starting to really get it. And it's a lot later than it should be, but I think across the government, we are definitely seeing this at the secretarial level. Our secretary, Secretary Johnson, engages with his colleagues on these issues on a very regular basis. And I have to say I see signs of optimism in my interaction with the private sector as well. I meet on a regular basis with CEOs of critical infrastructure, and they get it, that cybersecurity is part of your overall enterprise risk management, that it is not just about securing your IT networks. It's about looking at the ways in which your mission, if you're a federal government, your mission essential functions can be threatened, And if you're a corporation, the ways in which your continuity and your ability to provide services, including protection of your client data, can be threatened, and the ways in which cyber can do that. And then you do a risk management approach that does not stovepipe cyber and physical. And I see increasingly the private sector getting that, and I think we're moving in that direction in the federal government as well. And that is, I think, a very important step forward in achieving the kind of security and understanding the role of technology, the role of people, and the role of process.
And finally, Chris.
I appreciate that. I also appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's my first Aspen Security Forum. I hope I'll be invited back after we're all done. I see the opportunity for growth, and technology has really driven tremendous growth. And Intel, we're one of the companies. In fact, one of our founders is famous for Gordon Moore, with Moore's Law, and the progress that we've driven and the growth that we've driven in technology. What will be available to us as human beings is incredible when you think about possibilities for healthcare, possibly in transportation, energy, essential functions being transformed by technology. And while we have challenges, I think that are putting real pressure on us right now, the opportunities for growth and what we have seen with technology and what we're about to see with connected devices are the gentleman who introduced our panel mentioned, connected devices. That's going to change things, I think, even more dramatically than we've seen to date.
Very good. So we won't spend a lot of time on it, but I wanted to ask you about this process of internet governance that we're going through right now. We're basically transferring what was a US-dominated institution, the ICANN, that was controls part of the internet, into something new. And we're giving up something, but we're gaining something. And we've got this situation where we have these countries that have very little in common with the United States in terms of politics and economy and culture. And how are we going to find a common ground in a governance process? And is maybe that a huge opportunity to sort of deal with this issue and get common behavior that we're looking for? Suzanne, maybe first.
So, this is not going to be an easy transition, but again, I think one of the signs of optimism here is that we are going through a transition process that fully recognizes the important role of the private sector. And so, I was struck by the way this panel was introduced in the program about what are the rules of the road and which government gets to decide. That is a very traditional national security mindset. First, that a government would decide, and secondly, that it is, as opposed to a global threat requiring a global response, and secondly, that it is for governments alone to solve. The private sector has a unique role in cybersecurity, different than in our traditional national security context, and so multi-stakeholder approach to these governance issues is absolutely critical, and I think that's how we will make our way forward.
Chris, have you been involved in this?
Yeah, as a technology company, we can't help but be involved because we sell globally. We have customers both on the security side as well as on the classic Intel side, where we build microprocessors which go into pretty much everything. We're dealing with customers all around the globe, and so we've already been I would say embroiled in a lot of discussions around. Okay, well, what are the right norms? How should we be interacting at a geopolitical level as it relates to cybersecurity issues, because our products, our solutions are being used across countries, and that's something that I think it's really not. I think if you rewind the clock back 5 or 10 years, that wasn't as much in the discussion. I think the last 3 to 5 years, it's really hit home quite a bit.
Keith, how does this play into military cyber? Do these institutions emerging speak to the military question? We have hundreds of countries that are developing offensive military cyber capabilities.
Well, I think first, what Suzanne said about the private sector is absolutely right. They've got to be involved in this and help set it up. As we go forward, we can't afford to have this done, I'm going to use the word politicians, decide the future of the internet. The technology's got to help drive what's possible. And so as you look at it, that's the first thing. With respect to the military and others, well, Admiral Rogers will be up later this evening, and any tough questions, what we already decided, we throw to him. No, actually, from my perspective, This is an area that, whether we like it or not, I don't think we can unilaterally say it won't be used for military operations. It's too late. We're connected. I think that really drives us to now, how do you ensure we have a defensible architecture for countries, for sectors, and for our nation, and for our allies? And I think that's where we need to drive this, because we should not be naive enough to believe that we can say we won't use this and trust that others wouldn't in a crisis.
So one of the breathtaking aspects of Director Comey's interview yesterday was that this social messaging network that's barely 5 years old, that limits messages to 140 characters, is the principal propaganda tool in the world today. How did that happen, and what to do about it? Technology changes very quickly. You know, how does Twitter or Facebook fit into your sort of defensive responsibility, Susan?
Well, we have, in the National Protection Programs Directorate, which I lead, we have responsibility for both cybersecurity and the protection and defense of our civilian .gov networks and helping with the protection of .com networks and capacity building. But we also have the overarching mission of strengthening the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure. And so that brings us into the counterterrorism realm as well. And so we really see the convergence here between those two missions and the importance, again, of looking at these issues across both physical and cyber. And so we have been very much engaged with the department's countering violent extremism efforts and looking at the ways in which our adversaries are using cyberspace to their advantage. And how do we use cyberspace to counter that and to our advantage? And I think one of the, there are a couple key things there. One is that we have to recognize that one of the ways in which the internet is used is micro-targeting, right? And that's one of the things that the internet and cyberspace and big data analytics helps us to do. Well, we need to bring that to the CVE fight. We need to understand that it's not just one audience we're trying to reach. It's many audiences. It might be that individual who might be prone to being turned, but it might also be their friends. Friends don't let friends drive drunk. Maybe friends don't let friends go to Syria. It might be their parents. It might be their other members of their community. And so we need to talk about messages out there. And that's one of the things that Twitter allows you to do. Right? And it's one of the things that the internet allows you to do. So use that. Instead of being afraid of it, use it to our advantage.
Let me follow up hypothetically to try to avoid any kind of classification problem. One of the things that didn't seem to be spoken about when we talked about Twitter, we've talked about Twitter so far in this conference, is that it cuts both ways, doesn't it? It's true that nobody knows you're a dog on the internet, and I was thinking about it if I was an Islamic State operative trying to contact a 19-year-old in California, how could I be sure that I was talking to a 19-year-old and not somebody else? I would be very paranoid. I was taught that SIGINT is a big part of, of intelligence gathering today. Isn't this?
So I've heard.
Isn't this a gold mine for the U.S. to know where these people are?
Well, I think it clearly helps, especially in countering terrorism in other areas. I think what Comey said, though, and just to go back to clarify, I think you got two sets of issues here. First is, how do you ensure the security of communications and give law enforcement and the intelligence community the access they need under court orders or however we do it, so that they can protect our country and our people, and the same for our allies. That's a debate, because you have many countries coming in with many different sets of conditions. That's on the terrorism and how we use it for SIGINT. Then you have, how do we protect our networks? Because the same sets of messaging and stuff that can be used for communications and for terrorism can also be used to penetrate networks and other things. So you have two sets of issues that have to be looked at and have to be debated. It really resonated with me the way that Comey talked about the first part. How do we do this? And I think he's right. We've got to have the private sector, Silicon Valley in specific, to sit down with the government and say, is there a way that we can do both? that sets us up first as a nation, and then what about our allies and about other countries? I think that's the debate, and it's not an easy answer because you can see both sides of this issue. I do think you have to set that one aside. We have to solve that problem. Without it, we're going to have something bad happen before the debate. So have the debate now and get that so everybody's comfortable. I think on cybersecurity, that is yet a different issue about how networks are secured. And I think we should talk about that too, but it's not the same as over here on the communications.
Can I add something? So if I look at that particular use case, right, and I think of, what it tells me, however, is that, security issues are only going to become more and more personalized in our society. The situation where you've got, terrorist organizations recruiting people on Twitter who sit inside the United States, it's just a pointer to me of technology becoming a much more personalized aspect of pretty much all of our lives, in particular the upcoming generations. So part of what I'm thinking, part of what I think is going to be important for us is not honestly just to focus on what we see happening today, but as technology becomes more personalized, as it becomes more a part of what we're doing every single day, we've got to think more forward-looking around what are the implications of that from a policy perspective, from a security perspective, from a communications perspective, because I don't want to wait till it happens to start talking about it, like we're doing with this situation on Twitter right now.
Yeah. But Suzanne, I thought that one of the great challenges of Al-Qaeda was that they had gone to using couriers to talk to each other. And if the opposition now is using the internet, isn't that playing to our favor?
Well, not if they're taking advantage of the encryption technology that's now available to them. And that is precisely the challenge that the director talked about last night and that Keith was talking about. And I thought the director, talked about it, exactly right last night in terms of it is not a problem that government is going to force a solution to. He also acknowledged that it is something we need to consider in a much more granular way. It is not one problem. It is a range of technologies. And if we try to solve it as if it's one problem, we are going to be trying to solve the hardest part first, because that's inevitably what happens. So let's take the easier technologies first, begin to work our way through. We need to make this much more granular. And we do need to have those, we need to rebuild the trust that has made those conversations so difficult to have. And we need to find our way forward on this. And to some degree, we need to acknowledge in government that it may only be a delaying an inevitable. But if we can even have a conversation with the private sector that buys us time to figure out how we're going to deal with a world in which we don't perhaps have all the access we once had, that's meaningful, that's helpful, it's worth doing.
So I won't belabor it, but I do believe that knowing who is talking to who is a very valuable thing in this world. And perhaps we have a misconception about the internet, and we know much more about who is talking to who than we think we might. And I wanted to use that to get to the question of Tor, which I don't know if this happened on your watch, but I believe that Tor was largely funded by the US government, its development, for its own purposes. And was that a mistake in retrospect, given the role that Tor has now come to play in the world?
So I'm not familiar with the origins of Tor, to be honest. It's the Onion router, which is an anonymizer for anonymizing communications to and from. I'm not familiar with the origins of it. And so I don't know what the original intent was. It's like ideas that people have. Some of those ideas are pretty good, and you think, well, that makes sense under some conditions and not under others. The question is, how are they used? And this is an issue of setting up the policies and procedures, which become very difficult in an internet that's not easily governed. And so I think that's the real issue. You'd say, sure, if you want to anonymize for these reasons, it should be okay. But not if you're a bad guy and a terrorist, you shouldn't anonymize because we want to catch you. And if we could get them to that deal, we'd be okay.
Yeah. I guess just for historical record, I believe that Tor was largely funded by the Office of Naval Research because they were interested in our spies being able to communicate securely. I think that's the history. But let me use it to walk into the question of crypto. One of the things that Director Comey said last night is he sort of made a plea to sort of surface the best ideas that we might have in this country, technical ideas, to find a compromise. And you guys are in contact with those people. Are there some ideas to, first on the technical side, to make, to sort of to square the circle and to protect privacy and to make those things that law enforcement needs accessible? Do you think there are any new technical ideas?
If you think about it, encryption is not new. I mean, so we're talking about a very old technology and actually a relatively old set of techniques, for basically protecting communications. So, when I think about the crypto discussion, what worries me is that we're going to get very focused on how the government can actually get access to communications that are going over going over legitimate organizations' communication channels. And the reality is, a lot of the what we see happen very regularly is that attack patterns will move or communication patterns will move. So what I worry about is if we get too focused on, we need a specific organization or set of organizations, to follow a certain set of guidelines. We're gonna just push the traffic elsewhere. So I do think we need to take a step back and say, okay, we have a certain set of technologies. Some of them are used to protect the legitimate communications. It can also be used to protect illegitimate communications. How do we step back from the technology and say, what are other ways in which we can get at the problem we're trying to solve ultimately? And I think that's where some of the communications we started to have around information sharing, working together to define standards, define norms around what we do for these problems makes a lot of sense to me.
Suzanne, does the administration have a single point of view on this? I know Director Comey does, but what's the administration's point of view?
So the administration's point of view is we support very much strong encryption. And we particularly in the Department of Homeland Security, where we have the cybersecurity mission, we understand the tremendous value of strong encryption to cybersecurity, to protection of privacy, to human rights, advancing human rights around the world. But we also have a law enforcement mission in the department. And so we also understand very well the challenges that are presented if you cannot, with a judicial order, with probable cause to believe that criminal activity is taking place, access the kind of communications that our public policy has said that we think the government should be able to access. So there is no easy answer. That is yes, we are of one mind that is our position. But again, we do not know what the answer is and what the solution is. And I agree with Chris that the conversation needs to be broader. And partly, I think, again, because I think we need to think long term. Right. So as I say, even if we can come up with, for some of these technologies, some short-term ways in which we buy ourselves some time, ultimately what we're looking for is how do we, as you say, use technology to help be a more safe and secure nation. Mm-hmm. And it does have to be a broader conversation, and I think that helps us get some of the technology folks to the table.
Keith, do you have any, the last time we had this conversation, which started in 1992, the NSA was a big player in the conversation. This time, and maybe that'll change today, this time the ball has been carried by the FBI so far. Is there a reason why the ground has shifted?
Well, I think clearly the leaks and all the issues that are on the table. I think it most impacts the FBI right now with what's going on in the United States. I think what Director Comey talked about, all the threats that he sees in the country and the problem with encryption and not being able to see what those communications are. Let's say that he gets 1,000 messages today, and if he could read them, he'd know to go look at these 10 first. He can't do that, even with a court order, if the encryption, the people who he serves it to can't decrypt it. That's the issue. And so, I think this is where the debate has to go. What do we want? Do you want to have it all the way here? And I think people can put on the table, other countries can create encryption that we can't use, and bad guys can go get that we can't decrypt. What does that do to this? And what are nation states like China and Russia who say, not on my watch, we want it all? And how do you put all three of those together? So that makes it a very complex problem. There is no easy solution here. I think for my old unit, and Mike can correct this later, but it seems to me that, that's a huge mission to protect this country. They're the ones that stopped the Zazi New York City subway plot because they could read that communication. If they couldn't, that could have gone off. That would have been huge. So I think that's got to be a discussion that we have. And I think going into it, the first part is there isn't an easy answer here. And the second part, that's a debate. I do agree that if there is a unique solution, it's going to come from some of our innovators in the our tech community. And so that's where we ought to put it on the table, put all those problems up there and say, does anybody have a good solution here that we could all live with?
Chris, has anybody in Silicon Valley got any technical solutions that you think would move the ball down the field?
Yeah, I actually think.
Holding out on us, Chris?
Yeah.
Look, there's no shortage of new companies in Silicon Valley and old companies in Silicon Valley that are trying to race after this problem. I will tell you this, though. I do think one practical solution that I don't think we're talking enough about is, like, everybody would agree we have a huge shortage of cybersecurity expertise and professionals. Even in Silicon Valley, I cannot hire good experts who have technical backgrounds fast enough to build the product we need to help customers on the ground with the issues that they've got. And so one solution that I do think we could get after right today is we should have a CyberCorps. Like, we should be training a much larger group of people to deal not necessarily with geopolitical issues, but with the issues that are affecting citizens here in the U.S. Like for example, good example. It's almost something that's equivalent to a cyber national guard that we could actually use for what we're dealing with today. I worry very much about the average citizen, because the average citizen today in the U.S. should assume that his or her information has been compromised at this point. When you add up all the breaches, you add up the numbers, the average citizen has been compromised. Their information is out there. And we don't have enough people who actually are capable of helping either enforce against some of the issues that we're facing, or even defend in the organizations who are holding the sensitive information that's getting out there in the first place.
And is that a private sector problem? I mean, to what extent?
I think it's private sector and public sector.
I mean, imagine if Chris, with all the money he can pay, is having a hard time recruiting fast enough. The challenge for the government. And when I talk to folks like Chris, I want to try to make a deal here, right? Which is to say, you help work with us to build the pipeline. We'll work on that together. We'll take them right out of school. We'll give them on-the-job training, right? Give them a lot of responsibility fast, give them a sense of mission. You'll lure them away with offers of big bucks and a fancy house in Silicon Valley, and they'll go work for you for a while. And then when they've put their kids through college and they've made a lot of money, maybe they'll miss the mission and they'll come back to us.
That's exactly what I think we want to do. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. I think a lot of our team is like that. A lot of our team are people who've had military backgrounds, they've had intelligence backgrounds, but we just don't have enough. We don't have enough people going into the ranks today to really make a dent in this problem.
Walter had an idea on a CyberCorps, which was where you'd bring in young people. They would serve 1 year. I think that's a great idea, and Walter, it might be something that you put on the table, but they serve 1 year. You get them training. They get to serve in several of these missions. They can go in and get an idea of what government they'd probably serve at Cyber Command or NSA. I understand that. And a few at DHS, too.
Thank you.
And then off to Intel for big bucks, and then back after a year. But I do think that would help train. I think that's a good thing.
And even if they didn't wind up going to work in the cyber field, having a cadre of trained cyber citizens could be of tremendous benefit.
If I could tell a story, if that's okay, because a true story in this case, just so happens, because I think it's the reason that resonates with me is, and I know Mike Hayden and others are here. When I think about what the folks at NSA and Cyber Command are doing, and the folks in government, they're often vilified for no reason at all for doing what our nation is asking. I'm going to give you a great case in point. In 2013, in the midst of all the Snowden things, I got called down to the White House. I'm going to tell you what I said. I was called down, and I sat across from the National Security Advisor, and they said, the President and we have decided to do a review group on NSA. And I said, this is a great idea. We can get some great luminaries like Colin Powell and others. They'll tell what we did. And they said, well, actually, we've already selected the group, and they pushed it across the table. You know, when somebody pushes something across the table like this to you, it's not good news. So I read the first one, and I was reading on board member of the ACLU. And I said, I'm not proud of this. You've got to be shitting me. This guy's on the ACLU. And so they said, well, the president's already decided. So we went back, and the next day we briefed this team, and they're sitting about where you guys are out there. We had a big table at NSA, and the guy from the ACLU sitting at the end like this, and he looked at me like I was Darth Vader, you know, Luke. And I looked at him somewhat askance, and he had come with all these ideas of how he could fix NSA and do all these things. So I gave him all the briefing, our seniors gave it to him, and then we all left, and for the next 5 weeks, our young people did the job, showed him everything, 100% transparency. After the 5 weeks, he outbriefed it, and Art and others know some of this story, but he came around the table, and I thought, he's going to attack me. But actually came around, he shook my hand. I was stunned. He shook my hand, he said, you and your people have the greatest integrity of any agency I've ever seen. I was stunned. You could have hit me with a wet fish. And I said, well, don't tell me, tell the people of NSA, tell the White House, and tell the American people. And he said, I will. And so he wrote this set of things, and he said, you know, the people of NSA, they're stopping terrorist attacks, they're acting with great integrity, and they're following the rule of law, and they're doing exactly what we've asked them to do. And then he signed it, Jeffrey Stone, board member of the ACLU, and Presidential Review Group member. None of that really made the press. Because in this case, it's easier to vilify people in government and sell papers than it is to put the facts out there. And so from my perspective, so where we can help is this is a debate for the good of our country. It really is. These are great people that are working there. They're doing what we asked them. They hold themselves accountable. And after 18 months of review, not one person was found doing anything wrong with this data. That's a good thing. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have a debate like we just said. What it does say is you got to put the facts on the table so the American people really understand it. These are people whose only thought in life is how can I help our country? They take that very seriously. And it was a privilege and honor to serve with them, and I know that's the same kind of folks that are at DHS and every other, they're trying to do the right job. We, us people on the outside, got to help them.
So I wonder if there isn't a thought in that toward this encryption problem. You know, Larry Lessig said code is law, and our system of government is based on checks and balances. Chris or Suzanne, could we shard the key, the back door in such a way that there were multi-parties that held the key so that it was accountable? Would that work? Have you heard this as an approach?
I have heard it as an approach. It's one of the things that's been proposed, and one of the things that some of the experts, technical experts out there have said is not adequately, sufficiently secure. And does present a vulnerability. I'm not enough of a technical expert to do an independent assessment of that, but I think all of these ideas need to be out there. It does, you know, that proposal does bring to mind Clipper wars, dare we say, and some of the discussions then. But again, I think we need to have a lot of really smart, creative people looking at all kinds of answers there. And you know, I think part of what helps is if you. It's been presented as a debate of absolutes sometimes, right? That you have this absolutely secure technology out here, and anything that you do to permit any kind of access is going to make it completely insecure and completely vulnerable. And neither of those things is actually true. And what you're really looking at is along this spectrum.
So to that point, tell us about didn't you just have a 30-day sprint to try to make things, what did you do? And what did you get done? What didn't you get done?
So we did have a 30-day sprint, and it was really focused on identifying the high-value assets. And this is basic cybersecurity framework, NIST cybersecurity framework kinds of things. Identify your key assets, do your risk assessment. So we started by identifying what are the high-value assets within the government. and then all of some basic practices to protect those, to make sure that we can detect, respond, and recover. And so the 30-day sprint did that, and we were a participant in going then out to the departments and agencies that had the highest value assets. We started with repositories of bulk data to scan those, looking at the FISMA scorecard, Federal Information Security Management Act, and making sure that some of those basic steps that departments and agencies had put those in place with an appropriate sense of urgency. And so there were a number of things, and it was an interagency effort to get to jumpstart within 30 days. It does not end. We do not, at the end of 30 days, say, dare I say, mission accomplished. But instead, it's the beginning of an ongoing process with a greater sense of urgency.
Is your goal to have multi-factor authentication throughout the entire government, and how close are you to getting there?
Multi-factor identification is one of the most important things, and we talk about PIV access, particularly starting with privileged users, those who have the ability to really do a lot in your network and system, and moving to unprivileged users. And we've got dashboards, and frankly, I think it was one of the most successful things in the 30-day sprint was bringing folks up to where they needed to be on two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication.
I mean, to speak to the OPM situation, one of the problems with encrypting all your data is you can't search it. Is there a technical solution down the road to that, Chris? I mean, if we secure our own data, we secure it from ourselves, don't we?
Absolutely. I mean, this is where for example, we're investing heavily, for example, at the Intel level in analytics capabilities in silicon, so you can actually process larger and larger amounts of information faster. Like, for example, just a little bit over about a year or so ago, a year and a half ago, Intel did a big partnership with Cloudera. We made a huge investment in Cloudera, which is one of the Hadoop distribution providers that's out there. And we're literally working closely with companies like Cloudera in order to be able to accelerate all the analytics capabilities that they want to make available in the data center. So that's a big area of focus for us, is enabling ourselves to be able to process large amounts of data more quickly. So you could say, all right, now I want to overlay encryption on that data. You can still shoot at getting the same performance on the same amount of data, but do it at a lower cost. And that is something that Intel and most of our partners are investing very heavily in.
Suzanne, short of that, what do you do to prevent OPM kinds of situations with the information? I mean, you have these FS86 information?
SF86.
SF86. How do you protect it, short of new technology?
So again, there are, just as we talk to our private sector folks about basic cyber hygiene, and there are basic steps that frankly were not in place adequately across our federal.gov, civilian.gov departments and agencies. Federal cybersecurity was not and still is not where it needs to be, though it's better than it was. And so, again, as I say to our private sector folks, basic cyber hygiene can prevent, depending on which research study you look at, 80 to 90% of the intrusion activity that we see. So that is the starting place. And then you do a defense in depth, and that's a big part of our mission at the Department of Homeland Security, is providing a baseline of technology and practices for the civilian.gov. So you have a perimeter set of tools that allow you to know what's coming in and out of your systems. And our most recent iteration, this is our Einstein suite of tools, that allows you to block known signatures and known bad malicious activity that's coming in. We are rapidly developing the technology, working with the private sector, to be able to detect and block things we've never seen before, but have the attributes of bad behavior or look risky for a variety of reasons, using our large amounts of data and the analytics that the private sector helps us to do. So there is that, but then that's never going to be perfect. There's no silver bullet. So you have to assume they're going to get into your system. And so we have the suite of tools, working with the private sector again, continuous diagnostics and mitigation. Tells you on a near real-time, continuous basis about the health of your system. Is it configured properly, et cetera? The next phase, which the Secretary has directed us to accelerate, will tell you who's on your system. And the third phase of that will tell you what they're doing on your system. And again, those are ways to address vulnerabilities, but also for detection. We have to get much faster at detecting because we got to know that they're going to get through. So you got to detect them quickly. And then we're working with our interagency and private sector partners on more effective response. And then you got to be able to recover and be resilient.
So let me just add to it because this brings up an important part of the government-private industry partnership. First, Sony. I think everybody would get to the point where Sony should not attack back into North Korea for a whole host of reasons. Although Sony, I think, would have won. The reality is that's an inherently government responsibility. But here's the problem. The government could not see that Sony was being attacked. There is no way for a government to, like you do for aircraft flying over the country, for the government to know something bad is hitting one of our commercial entities and they need help. And it's got to be the government that steps in. And we can't say to the commercial side, you guys do really good and a nation state will come in here and kick your butt. Can't do that. So we got to have both. I think it's got to come up with a way. And I'm going to take this one step further. Imagine, so we can do this, but the big banks, my experience since I've been out, the big banks are the best in the world at securing their enterprise. If JP Morgan gets hacked, we got a problem. And so the approach that we're taking is not sufficient. Imagine if we did this, and every one of these tables was an individual entity that, like a radar, could share data, cybersecurity data, not personally identifiable, about when they're being probed. When JP Morgan was attacked, 6 other banks were also probed at the same time. But that all went into their firewall logs. It's very difficult to see and very difficult to share, is not shared. What if it was shared? They would all known that these East European actors were going after them. They would have seen it and they would have been secured. And what that does is it brings you to a point with, if they could share it within a sector, they could share it with government. And if you did, then Sony would have had a way of telling the government, help us at network speed, and the government could have helped them.
The other advantage, John, to the kind of information sharing that Keith is talking about is that it does allow you, if you've got this network that he describes, and imagine that these tables are all connected, whether they all come into the NKIC at DHS, which we would like that to happen, or not, the important thing is that they're sharing information, then you can imagine a world in which the adversary maybe can get away with something once, but only once. Because as soon as it comes in, it's detected, the indicators are picked up and rapidly shared with everyone, and the filters are in place to block that. That would be a huge advance from today.
The exploitation surface of 7,000 banks is far bigger than the government can see by itself.
Well, let me ask it in a different way. So the banks have better, if not best practices, but we have a set of ISPs that have broad view of the internet. And I think it's pretty well known that they're not doing everything they could because it would cost money. For example, amplification attacks. They're fairly straightforward protocols and hardware you could install in an ISP, and it just hasn't been done. But how do you get them to move?
So actually, what we just talked about there, the ISPs become a key part of it because the ISPs see all of those entities and would be a key part. So this is where, actually commercial industry, the financial sector, the energy sector, the healthcare sector, and the government could each build their own. The ISPs become a critical part of that because they're serving all the communications. The ISPs can do things on these distributed denial of service attacks and other things like that to clean those out. But to be quite honest, those aren't the things that are really tearing people up. It's these exploitations that are very stealthy and very difficult. And so that's where the power of the internet is what we can all see, not what one company sees. And so if you bring that together, do it publicly so everybody knows what's going to be on the table, what you end up with is, think of this, instead of one bank protecting itself, 7,000 banks help and protect each bank. That's far beyond. And then do the same for all the others and the same for the government.
Part of the way that they're doing that and doing that so quickly is machine-to-machine sharing of that information. And that is another effort that we have underway that the Secretary has directed us to complete in short order and should be done ready in a few months to both send and receive, because we've developed the language and the protocols for machines to share threat indicators with machines in milliseconds in ways that are consistent with privacy protection and civil liberties. And that's why we are so anxious to have Congress enact this information sharing legislation. And you started in a wonderful way by asking for sources of optimism. I will say that Congress, interestingly enough and unusually enough, is a source of optimism in this context. They passed 5 cybersecurity bills. I used to work, as a congressional staff, I can say that. But a Congress that does not do a whole lot has actually made progress in cybersecurity on a bipartisan basis. And I commend the leaders of the Homeland Security committees particularly for that progress. And they are moving forward on information sharing legislation and on authorizing that suite of tools that I talked about Einstein, which is very important. And as the Secretary said, our third legislative agenda item is a national breach notification law.
So I'm going to open this up in a second, but I wanted to ask one last question, and that is that this is a network that we're all connected by that was built with no thought of privacy or security architecturally at the outset. There are a couple of efforts around the world to start over, to start with a clean slate. They're very interesting, and are any of them practical? Are we going to be saddled with this particular network for the rest of?
So I think, if technology doubles every 2 years, it's really when can you refresh in a rate that doesn't hose the industrial players? Because when you look at the IT infrastructure, it's a $6 trillion investment. You're not easily going to change all that out. What you're going to have to do is build, here's where we want to be, and a path to get there that's efficient. So I think we ought to come up with ideas that put in civil liberties, privacy, and security, and then put that in as a capability and say, how do we build to that? It's not going to be a jump shift. It's going to take time. When you look at what's out in companies today, I'm surprised you see people with, Windows 1990, whatever, and you think, wow, I didn't know that was supported anymore. It's not. And, and they have the range of systems out there.
Yeah, I think that's actually a big part of the problem. I mean, one of the reasons we're seeing so many breaches is there's a ton of debt. There's just debt that hasn't been paid. Like, as a guy who's been doing this for many years now, we used to be a back office function of IT, right? And now all of a sudden we're in the boardroom, the Oval Office cares about what's going on in cybersecurity, but that's like literally happened over the course of just a few years. And then you've got a technical infrastructure out there that, literally was still running mainframes, we're still running very old systems. And so we've got to protect not only that, but now we've got to connect, sort of protect automobiles that are now all connected by the internet. So when you add that all up, I don't think it's going to be about replacing what we have today with something new, but it will be about migrating, to some of these newer architectures, so that we can, get some of the best of the both, where we're balancing privacy and balancing security. But we still have to pay attention to legacy, and we are going to have to pay down the debt. It's not free. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind.
We have a few minutes. Questions from the audience? Why don't we start there? If someone could take him a microphone. Gentleman in the purple shirt. Oops.
Thank you. Sean Waterman from Politico. I wanted to ask, recently the US government promoted in the UN group of governmental experts 3 peacetime norms for cybersecurity, that countries won't attack each other's critical infrastructure, that they won't attack each other's certs, and I'm blanking on the third. But,
economic espionage.
No,
there are actually 4. Yeah. There are actually 4, yeah.
But they only promoted 3 of them in the GGE. Could you comment on that? I mean, is that realistic? I mean, General Alexander, you said, we can't unilaterally declare this as a civilian zone, but I mean, isn't there something that has to be done to try and put in place basic rules of the road?
In my opinion, yes. I think you can't do that with today's infrastructure, in my opinion. I think what you have to have is a defensible architecture that you can ensure that you could stop that. And what we talked about, and I think between Suzanne and I and Chris, is there is an opportunity here to make this much more defensible. First, we got to get there before anybody's going to adhere to any other principles, because I think this is going to be much like the nuclear race. A different analogy is that you have to have the ability to stand back up right now, and we don't. Our infrastructure across the board is susceptible to all these exploits. It's very difficult to enact that when those countries that seek to do us harm can only do it through one of two ways, cyber and terrorism. They're going to reach out no matter what they say in those things and try to do it stealthily. So I think we've got to fix both and come up with a way of holding them accountable in this space. I'm not sure we're at the point yet that we can hold them accountable or prove that they did it.
I guess I would disagree
Say it ain't so.
slightly. Yeah, for the first time up here. But I don't think I think if you have a perfectly defensible network, you don't need norms of behavior. We need norms of behavior precisely because we all are so vulnerable, and precisely because offense has so rapidly outstripped defense across the board. And I think, this discussion about these peacetime norms reminds me of, back in the 70s when there was a lot of talk about, couldn't we have an international treaty on counterterrorism, on terrorism? And we couldn't. It was too hard. There were differing views. And as we have today, with fundamentally different views, not everyone agrees that with our view that the internet should be open, interoperable, secure, and resilient, right? There are fundamentally different views. And so what we did in counterterrorism is we bit off the pieces where we thought we had consensus. So we had a treaty on aircraft hijacking, for example, right? And these peacetime norms are attempting to do that. We are not succeeding in coming to a big, grand consensus around cybersecurity, but maybe we can say these cybersecurity incident response teams are kind of like ambulances coming to the rescue, that we have an international consensus that you shouldn't attack ambulances. And they're also kind of like command and control in the nuclear context, where we all sort of had an agreement that you don't go after command and control because you need a way to pull things back. We all understand that we're all vulnerable to attacks against infrastructure that are critical to providing services for the public, and that maybe we can take those off as legitimate targets, for example.
So just to add to the disagreement, the key point, and I think it's not actually a disagreement, it is, in order for our country to defend itself, so we have to have a defensible architecture. I think everybody would agree to that. It won't be perfect, but our government needs to know when we're under attack, and today we don't. If we could get to that point, step one is, I think our nation would be the best in the world. If somebody chose to attack us in cyber or physical space, if we could know that at network speed, then the rules of the road become much more, I think, meaningful to everybody, because they're going to look at it and say, okay, this country can defend itself. If we attack them, we know they can reciprocate. We're not going to do that. Take that off the table that way. I think if we do it without fixing our infrastructure, then it's going to be so many gaps in it that we won't ever get there. Those countries that are on the other side of this argument will say yes, but mean no. And so I think we have to take some steps, and I think that's where bringing in the ability to communicate with these devices and networks and systems and the legislation is hugely important for our nation and then for our allies.
This gentleman here.
Alexander Rostolimo, Center for Security and Social Progress. General Alexander mentioned the extremely high speed of technological progress and the doubling every 2 years. Now, Chuck Vest was president of MIT and of the National Academy of Engineering. At a symposium some 10 years ago, I heard him say the following profound statement. He said, "We must never forget that technological progress occurs at a much, much faster rate than human and sociological progress." If that is true, it suggests that many people may be afraid of high-speed technological change and may dislike it. Could that be a source or a driving force for terrorism in general, or cyber terrorism also?
Suzanne, do you have a thought?
So there certainly has been, and there are scholars in this room who are far better equipped to address this, but I've read their works. And there certainly is some thought that the rapid pace of change and modernization has contributed to some of the groundswell of support for destructive nature of terrorism.
So if I could just add, I think this is where, and Walter and the idea of a CyberCorps that could be hosted, I think it's a huge education problem that we have. When you look at how many people really understand the internet, we have 4 generations working side by side. This is a generation that says, write me, call me, email me, text me. And they're all working side by side, but they all have a different view of the network. We could take a generation now with these kinds of ideas on the CyberCorps and educate them on what could be. And I think that would be hugely beneficial to our nation to do that, so that they would understand what we could do and why this is important.
One quick last question, way at the back.
The LA Times.
Hi, I'm Brian Bennett from the Los Angeles Times. Should the U.S. be investing in developing a cyber weapon that would act as a cyber deterrent? Something like the nuclear deterrence policy that the U.S. had during the Cold War, that would be so powerful that any state actor would not want to launch cyber attacks on U.S. interests. What are the pitfalls of that, and should the U.S. be investing in that?
Chris?
I'm not touching that one. I think there's 0 minutes remaining.
Oh, look at that, we're out of time.
One quick answer.
What I would say to that is, look, one thing we can't forget is this, there is a significant criminal element that's out there. We can't, while we're discussing nation-state-oriented attacks, there is a lot of criminal activity that does need to be dealt with, and that kind of a deterrent isn't going to deal with that problem. We cannot forget, we have citizens, men and women, children that are affected by what's happening here. And so I want to make sure we're balanced the discussion a little bit between what goes on between nation states and what's affecting people in our society. And I think that's an important piece of this. The law enforcement aspect is critical.
Keith Alexander, was the last word.
I think, in all honesty, I think we should recognize that all countries are racing forward in this area. And, all the meetings I've ever sat in the White House through both administrations shows great concern for doing this exactly right, setting this up. So I think every nation is going to create both offensive and defensive capabilities. And the nice part about our country, there's civilian control and a thoughtful process in how we use it. And I think the president said that in his 2009 thing on cyber, which is anybody who attacks us in cyber, we'll look at the full spectrum. I think the military's objective is to provide those options to the president and the civilian leadership, and then they choose how they want to respond.
Our hour is up. Please thank our panelists.